Okay, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Kenneth Khan. I'm the Honorary Secretary at ACI and also the Chair of the Education Committee. Thank you. Welcome everyone for coming here to attend our seminar tonight. It's the second one for the year. It's on the Global FX Code. We are very fortunate tonight to have a panel of distinguished speakers here. How it's going to work out is for the first half an hour, Mr. Lam Chee Kin from DBS will give us his latest update on the code, which he has been working with the SFEMC and also the BIS to come up with the latest version. And after that, we will have a panel discussion. The moderator will be Mr. Brian Yap, followed by the question and answer session for all of us to ask questions. So let me introduce Mr. Lam Chee Kin. He is the Group Head of Compliance, Legal and Compliance, and also the Group Secretary at DBS. He's a lawyer by training and has had about 20 years experience in this industry across multiple business types and geographies. Prior to working at DBS, he spent some time in JP Morgan and Standard Chartered, and also worked in some law firms, Raja & Tan, Allen and Gladhill. Mr. Lam currently serves on the Disciplinary Committee in the SGX, the Advisory Panel of the NUS Center for Banking Finance Law, the Data Protection Advisory Committee of Singapore, and the Standards Committee for the Institute of Banking and Finance. In 2015, he was recognized by the IBF as a distinguished fellow in the field of compliance. So after this mouthful, let me please welcome on stage Mr. Lam Chee Kin.
Yeah, so it's a mouthful. Today's session is going to be recorded. However, in order for some of what we're going to talk about to be truly useful, I think we need to inject a level of openness and authenticity with regard to the issues that we face and the issues that we hope to come out of in terms of the work that we're doing. So we do encourage, in a sense, open participation and open questioning, and we'll do our very best to, in a sense, take on and grapple with some of the issues that we have to deal with. Okay, I'm going to give some background as to why this global code work started. So overall agenda for today, some notes on the background, so the context to why we started on this work. Some of the timelines that we're dealing with, key timelines to remember. We are now in phase 1. Okay, so phase 1 has been launched as of 2016. The full adherence period won't kick in until phase 2 kicks in. Phase 2 will kick in 2017. And we'll talk about how that works in the Singapore context as well. Okay, so that's just a highlight around timelines. Third, who does this code apply to? And what does it apply to? We'll cover that. And then very broadly, right, highlights as to the content of the code and some of the selected key issues that we really grappled with as a group in terms of talking about the trade-offs, the various interests between the sell side, the interests of the buy side, and the clients, how to come to the correct phrasing of the standards that we were going to adopt. That's probably one of the most useful things to just digest and then internalize, and then to also give feedback and constructive comments as to what we should be doing with these standards. And then finally, a key issue and probably an elephant in the room is the whole issue of adherence. How do we get everybody, it's a global code, how do we get everybody to participate and to agree to sign up to the standards contemplated in the code? And that includes corporates, that includes the buy side, and so on and so forth. In this respect, what's particularly useful would be, frankly, feedback or comments or input to us as to ideas for incentivizing adherence or ideas for creating adherence to the code. That's, that would be considered extremely valuable feedback for us today. Okay, so that's the overall approach for this next half hour, and I'll go through this reasonably quickly. Okay, so why did we start on all of this? On the 21st of July 2015, right, BIS formed the Foreign Exchange Working Group, and the terms of reference for the Foreign Exchange Working Group are set out there. As all of us are familiar with, all this started with fundamentally LIBOR enforcement, moving into WMR FX enforcement action. Okay, so it all started with that. The WMR FX enforcement called into question a number of historical practices in the FX asset class. And as a community, I guess there was a little bit of a disconnect between what had been going on previously and what appeared to be the standards that were imposed by enforcement actions. What then resulted, because of a certain degree of concern, in the spirit of authenticity, I think we do need to talk about this point, right? As a result of the enforcement actions, there was a degree of concern, you could say, almost even a degree of paralysis in the industry, in the sense that people got very concerned about communicating with each other, what would be permitted, what wouldn't be permitted, what type of information sharing is okay. Is it going to be then subject to market manipulation enforcement? Is that going to be subject to competition enforcement? So actually this was, frankly, a very big concern at the central banks. So in a sense, to be completely fair and to give credit to the central banks, they noted that actually this was a result following a lot of enforcement and the consequent paralysis in the industry following the enforcement actions. Now, one option was to actually try to start regulating the FX asset class, the FX industry. So some of us may be familiar, sometime 2014, late 2013, 2014, the Bank of England started what they called the Fair and Effective Markets Review. And this was actually a broad-based review designed to kind of say, hang on, if we were to kind of like impose new standards in relation to the FX asset class with an option to regulate, would this be something that would be productive? The Fair and Effective Markets Review finally concluded that no, regulation wasn't the best tool. And the consensus then developed among the central banks that, hey, let's try this by a code of conduct as opposed to regulation. There's several advantages to a code of conduct, and there are several disadvantages as well. So these are the trade-offs that I guess have to be dealt with. The advantages of a global code of conduct is that because it's not law, you don't need to go through the parliamentary process in all the jurisdictions that develop these laws. Also, because it's not law, you don't have to have a process like MiFID, for those of you who know MiFID, or Dodd-Frank Volcker. You don't have to have a process like that, where in a sense one jurisdiction passes something, and because of the interconnected nature of the markets, that rule, which applies, let's say, in a US or European context, then frankly affects everybody because of the interconnected nature of markets. So the advantage of using a process which wasn't rooted in the law had the advantage of being able to be universally applicable from day one. The other thing that you could achieve, because it's not law, is you could bring other central banks along, right? So for example, China is a part of this process, India is a part of this process. You can actually build the consensus among central banks to do something which was a truly global initiative. And if I were to say this is one of the remarkably positive things about this piece of work, there's an incredible amount of consensus and an incredible amount of commitment among the central banks, recognizing the importance of this, not just for the liquidity reasons that we had talked about previously, but also as a signal that not everything needs to be done by way of something like Dodd-Frank or MiFID. If the community can truly get together and actually raise standards globally, then it's worth doing as an initiative otherwise than by the law. There are some disadvantages. The disadvantages will, of course, be that, at the end of the day, if it's not law, then supervisory authorities would still be able to use the law in relation to the way they do enforcement and so on and so forth. Okay, and that's perhaps something that we'll have to deal with going forward in Q&A. But if you also think about it, if the standards are set by the global code, and frankly everybody's following the standards, it gets a little bit difficult for a supervisory authority to then say, no, actually I'm going to break away and I'm going to go in a slightly different direction, because this is actually a consistent approach that is taken across the industry. But I'm just going to tee that up as the background for why we're doing this and why this particular route was chosen, the vehicle being a code of conduct rather than operation of law. Okay? Next, how is this being governed? Being a code of conduct, there's a global aspect to this and there's a local aspect to this. The global aspect, as Kenneth said earlier, there is a foreign exchange working group. It is formed and it's under the auspices of BIS. The foreign exchange working group leverages off the input of market professionals, which advise the foreign exchange working group as to what's the best position to adopt. So the foreign exchange working group is basically the central banks, and the market professionals group, the MPG, sorry, the market participants group, the MPG, is composed of a very broad cross-section of representatives. Okay, so it includes sell side, it includes buy side, it includes corporates, it includes platforms, it includes high-frequency traders, and so on and so forth. A very, very large cross-section of participants from the professionals in the industry. We are part of the market participants group. So Asia has several representatives based across Australia, Hong Kong, China, that are inputting into this group. And I'll say one thing in particular. For phase one, we didn't have an Asian subgroup of the MPG. For phase two, we do. One of the things we noticed between phase one and phase two was sometimes the Asian perspective wasn't quite fleshed out. So for phase two, we formed an Asian working group specifically to put in Asian-specific input into the work. Okay, so that's how the global work works, and that's how it's aligned. Within Singapore, all this is supervised, or well, it comes under the governance of the Singapore Foreign Exchange Markets Committee. So we're actually privileged to have actually many, many members of SFEMC here today. SFEMC has formed a Blue Book working group whose terms of reference are now expanded to include the work effectively that the MPG would do as representing the voice of Singapore and then inputting into FXWG. Okay, and frankly, again, on the SFEMC working group level locally, we're also privileged to have several members of the working group here today. They're on the panel today as well. So Stuart and Anderson are on the working group for Singapore. Okay, so that ties up the way the governance works. It's both globally aligned and then locally aligned. Okay, next. Key timelines, we talked a little bit around the fact that we are now in phase one. So phase one has launched. Now, phase one carries with it substantial language on information sharing. So one of the objectives for phase one, without going into a full adherence period, okay, so an adherence period means sign up, implement everything, right? In phase one, the release of this early language was to hopefully unlock some of the paralysis or the concerns that existed in the industry by being clear on what protocols existed around information sharing. Okay, so I guess this illustrates the commitment of the central banks to try to help the industry in the sense that the phase one work was prioritized so that we release some language around information sharing so that actually the market could start getting used to the protocols around information sharing. Okay, so where it used to be, for example, you'd kind of disclose specific levels, so you talk about where your stops were and so on and so forth. Information sharing now overlays all of that with specific criteria that we should be adopting, including specific examples about how we should communicate around sharing of orders, sharing of where the customers are, how to communicate with brokers, how customers should communicate with sell side, and so on and so forth. Okay, so that's really where we are right now in phase one. As I said, adherence has not kicked in yet, right? In phase two, which will be released May 2017, and again, there's a huge amount of commitment to hit this deadline. So there's a lot of pressure on the MPG to get this done in phase two. Phase two will basically have the remainder of the content. I'll run through the content later on. But phase two will also then be when we announce what are the adherence protocols that we'll be talking about. Now, there is a logical question, which is, hey, in Singapore, we have the Blue Book, right? So what's going to happen to the Blue Book? The idea now basically is that the Global Code of Conduct will, as much as possible, replace the Blue Book. But having said that, since the Global Code of Conduct is specific to the asset class, the FX asset class, the Blue Book will still probably need a little bit of supplementary information around other asset classes and stuff that's not contained in the main body of the FX, the Global Code. Right? So for example, Chapter 12 of the Blue Book is on financial benchmarks. And it's just conduct around financial benchmarks. And it's very likely that Chapter 12 will still need to continue even though we have the Global Code of Conduct. Okay. But that's basically the intention. Global Code of Conduct will replace the Blue Book as much as possible. And then after that, if necessary, we will supplement with things that are very specific for the Blue Book, for Singapore. There's also a very logical point, which is then what happens to the FMRP training that's done today for IBF for new entrants into the sales and trading community. The FMRP examinations will then be updated to take into account the content of the Global Code. Okay. Okay. Next. So what does the Global Code cover? It applies basically to all wholesale market participants and to the FX asset class. What are wholesale market participants? If you're carrying on business in FX in the financial markets, that's number one. Or if you are a platform provider, or you provide FX benchmark services. Okay, so these three classes of people are covered as a wholesale market participant. And you're not excluded as a retail participant as defined by local laws. Okay, so for example, in certain jurisdictions, there'll be definitions of retail participants. Those are not wholesale market participants. But by and large, I would expect that pretty much everybody in this room would be a wholesale market participant, right? So you carry on the business of trading in FX, you're a platform provider, or you're a provider of FX benchmark services, then you're covered. It's intended also to include corporate treasuries. It's also intended to include family offices who are carrying on treasury operations as part of their business. The idea being that this is a code of conduct that applies to the whole industry, that sets the standards for the whole industry. So as we went through the exercise of trying to decide who was included and who was excluded, we had to address all these questions, right? So our family offices included, our SMEs included, and so on and so forth. That's why the definition up there, if you carry on business in the financial markets, buying and selling FX, then you are included, right? So it's only if you're not doing that, then you're excluded. Okay. If it applies to you, there are still some benefits, right? In the sense that it does standardize conduct, so that there is a level of clarity as to how sell side should be interacting with sell side. There's a level of clarity as to how buy side should be interacting with sell side. Customers should be interacting with sell side as well. There are some benefits also around standardized formats for communications. So in a sense, if we say communications as far as possible should not disclose specific levels, right? It should be general information, anonymized information. That's where it helps because it standardizes conduct across the industry. And like I said earlier, it's achieved without regulation, right? So it is, so I'm a lawyer, right? So one of the things that we love is to kind of get into the micro details of how to apply a law to somebody, and then sometimes that drives people crazy. So this is achieved without regulation. It's achieved as a code of conduct, and hopefully that will kind of bring certain benefits along with it, rather than primarily making it a legal exercise in interpretation. Okay, next, the content that we're covering. I did say that the primary objective of phase one was information sharing. Okay, so basically to unlock liquidity in the markets and to standardize conduct around information sharing, that was really the objective of phase one. Phase one has a bit of other content as well. around ethics, execution, confirmations, and settlement. There are a few things in execution that we should talk about, and I'll specifically cover that later on in kind of key issues arising from the code of conduct. But otherwise, the content is pretty self-explanatory. Okay, so for example, under ethics, ethics talks about integrity. Ethics talks about professionalism. Okay, so what does integrity mean? What does professionalism mean? Pretty standard stuff. Confirmations and settlement talks about basically confirmations protocols, right? Exchange of SSIDs, honoring trades, when do you bust a trade, so on and so forth. Pretty standard stuff. So information sharing and execution are the two parts which I'll draw out, and I'll just cover them later on. In phase 2, which is being drafted right now, we will also have content on governance, risk management, electronic trading, and prime brokerage. Electronic trading specifically will also address the issue of last look. As you can expect, governance and risk management is not very controversial, right? So that is actually not likely to kind of create a lot of issues. It is possible as we go through electronic trading, as we go through prime brokerage, that, you know, things will come up. Last look is one of them. Another point that we should probably reflect on being in Asia is to also think about, you know, actually, how does the content on electronic trading, how is that relevant to us, given the relatively lower penetration rates of electronic trading in our footprint, right? So this is being drafted primarily from a kind of a G10 US European type of framework or footprint. One of the things that we would consider very useful is if the participants could also give us input, or give Anderson and Stewart input on things that we should be thinking about from an Asian perspective. You know? Another example of things that we should be considering from an Asian perspective, which we've already taken on, is NDF conduct. Right? So how many times do we come under pressure to kind of do stuff which may not necessarily be agreeable from a public policy perspective in our onshore markets, even though you know, in a sense, the NDF is traded offshore. Okay, so it's things like that you know, I would flag up here as saying, you know, this is the type of content and this is the type of conversation that we should be having, because it will produce a stronger code. What will be helping is to build the consensus across the whole industry, the whole world, as to what we should be doing with certain types of practices, certain types of trades, or certain types of geographies which we face out here in Asia as well. Okay, so just moving now, you know, I've been you know, 30,000 feet, and we're kind of getting more and more granular slowly, right? Now moving into some of the more detailed content in phase 1. So very quickly, the protocol around information sharing has really been centered on how do we communicate market color more effectively, right? Because this was probably the practice that was questioned the most in connection with the historical conduct enforcement actions. So you'll be, I guess, pleased to know, if you've read the code also, that there's a specific sentence which says market color is recognized as an integral part. Sharing of market color is recognized as an integral part of an efficient, open, and transparent market. Not controversial. The MPG proposed this language, and, you know, it was pretty much recognized that it was important, and so the language was incorporated into the drafting. Okay, so a sense of clarity, right, that the practice of sharing market color was approved. However, instead of being specific, because as you know, the sharing of market color raises two potential issues, right? One is a potential for a market manipulation issue. The second issue that sharing of market color could potentially raise is a competition law issue, right? So the way to address these two things was to prescribe a standard that if you share market color, it needs to be generalized, it needs to be anonymized, and it needs to be aggregated. So specific transactional information, specific customer information, that is what we should be avoiding. And instead, what we should be trying to do is to make our communications general, anonymized, and aggregated. And then there are examples in the appendix that are intended to bring this out. The examples are probably debated more than anything else. And so, of course, for those of you who have read the examples and also want to give input on the examples, then great, let's go for it. There's been a degree of adoption for this standard as from an industry perspective. We are familiar, we've tested this out with many institutions, and there's been a level of acceptance that actually this is the standard that we all should be migrating towards. Okay, that's information sharing. On execution, so there is a standard that's come in where we're basically taking something that actually a lot of US and European banks have been doing, right? So which is basically your disclosure statement describing your role when you're executing a transaction. So whether you're principal, whether you're agent, disclose that upfront and disclose the terms attached to that. That disclosure basically also includes how you handle orders. And specifically, you should, if you carry out the practice of pre-hedging, you should disclose that you do pre-hedging and disclose your practices around pre-hedging. If you run an agency capacity, then pre-hedging is not allowed. Otherwise, this is the test that is set out in the code. You can carry out pre-hedging as long as it is done in a way that is not meant to disadvantage the client or disrupt the market. This was probably one of the phrases that was most heavily debated in the phase 1 draft. We spent a lot of time talking over what was the correct test. This was finally the compromise position that was reached in order to build the necessary consensus across all the participants, which means sell side, buy side, corporate participants, all of them finally said, okay, fine, this is the language that we'll adopt. Finally, on markup, this may seem pretty obvious, especially if you're coming at it from a sell-side perspective. So disclose the factors which go into the markup. The reason this is here is because there was an opposite view. The opposite view was disclose the markup in relation to every single transaction, right? So in other words, the client then got a choice to kind of whether to trade or not to trade, not just on the pricing that you gave, but also based on the markup that you gave. So that was not the position that was adopted. Instead, the disclosure is the factors which go into the markup. And then on the back end, maintain controls in order to make sure that you're adhering to the policy that your institution has around markup. Okay, so that's execution. I do expect maybe a few questions around information sharing execution. We'll be happy to deal with them in the panel afterwards, where I can ask panel colleagues to jump in. But feel free to also ask questions as to how these things are intended to work. Okay. Okay. Next. If anything, this is probably the most difficult issue, in my opinion. If anything, adherence is the most difficult issue. And the challenge, from my perspective, in my opinion, can be phrased like this. Challenge A is adherence and adoption of the code by the sell side is probable, if not extremely likely. Okay? So the sell side is probably going to sign on to this. The challenge will be kind of helping the buy side and helping the corporate customers come on board and to say, you know what, we're also going to adopt these standards. And how adherence specifically applies to the buy side and to corporates, right? So for example, if you're talking about execution conduct, then actually primary applicability is to the sell side, right? If you're talking about information sharing conduct, yes, that affects everybody, right? But if you're talking about execution, it's mainly the sell side, how you disclose your role, how you do your markup, and so on and so forth. The other challenge, especially coming at this from an Asian perspective, right, is that many of us operate with broad ASEAN or Asian footprint in this type of region. FXWG doesn't currently have representation from Indonesia, Malaysia, Taiwan, and so on, right? So one of the likely challenges that we'll face is how to get countries or geographies that are not represented on FXWG into the adherence mechanisms. Otherwise, what we'll be doing is creating a little bit of a risk of, in a sense, some of the countries running ahead with full adherence and operating to the standards contemplated in the code, and then other countries, possibly competitors, right, taking different positions. And that's not necessarily a happy position for us, especially out here. So if I could just park this topic and maybe say this is perhaps one of the core issues on which input is welcomed, right? And if we could maybe think about the input on non-FXWG countries, trying to incentivize adherence in those countries, and also thinking about incentivizing adherence among the corporate and the buy-side community, that would be particularly helpful to the work that's going on. Right? Because we still have between now and May 2017 to do this, and you know, there is no bad idea out there. Literally, you know, from having done this work for upwards of a year already, there is no bad idea. Every single idea goes into an analysis, and you know, we've probably run through thousands of comments from every sector on many of the lines that we drafted. The input is welcome, and there's a very strong effort to get to the right position, bearing in mind the various stakeholder interests that are represented by the input. Okay, so I'll just kind of like maybe think about, flag out some of the ideas here, right? Which is, one of the ideas could be, you know, kite marks or registers, central registries of institutions or countries that have signed up to this. Another idea could be, well, don't do this on an entity-by-entity basis. Look for representative organizations, so Hong Kong TMA, SFEMC, chambers of commerce, think of associations representing buy-side, you know, fund managers associations, asset managers associations. Get those associations to kind of issue statements of adoption of the code. Another idea is, well, get ISDA to change standard warranties in standard form contracts, get platforms to insert warranties into standard form contracts. All these kinds of things. In fact, it's probably not one idea, but it's probably an array of ideas and proposals that would then maximize adoption across the board. Okay, so yeah, we need as many ideas as possible. And so on that note, since we're thinking about ideas and all that, you know, I'll stop, and then we'll go into the panel discussion. Okay, thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Chee Kin. So now we come to the second part of this evening, the panel discussion. I'm going to introduce our moderator for tonight and let him introduce the rest of his panel. I think for most of us in this room, Brian Yap needs no introduction. He's been in the market for 20 years, worked in Citibank for 8 and Deutsche for 12. His last post in Deutsche was emerging market head of Asia, and also sitting on the Global Markets Asia Exco. He is now MD and CEO of Dawn Consulting, which he founded in 2008. And Brian has been on the ACI Exco since 2001, and he was at one time also the honorary secretary